You ever feel like you're just drowning in information overload these days?
Tell me about it.
Like everywhere you turn, there's just something new to know or some debate raging online.
Right.
And it's like, does any of it really matter?
Well,
Well, today we're going back in time to a period where the stakes of information and truth were about as high as they could get.
right.
We're talking 6th century Europe
Okay.
with a guy named Saint Eleutherius of Tournai.
I've heard of this guy.
He was a bishop
Okay.
dealing with some seriously big questions.
Like what kind of questions?
Questions about the nature of God, salvation, heresy, even miracles.
Oh, wow. So he was dealing with like the really big picture stuff.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that he was doing this in a time of huge upheaval.
Oh, but
Christianity was still relatively new on the scene, and people were trying to figure out what it actually meant to be Christian.
so kind of like being an influencer for a brand new social media platform today.
In a way, I guess. Except the stakes were way higher than just going viral.
For sure. We're talking about eternal salvation here.
Exactly. And one of the core ideas Eleutherius was wrestling with was the Trinity.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
You know, Father, Son, Holy Spirit all being one God.
Right. It's one of those things that sounds simple on the surface, but then you try to actually explain it.
And it can get really confusing really fast.
Absolutely. But what's cool is that we see Eleutherius in his sermons really trying to break this complex idea down for his congregation.
So how did he do that?
Well, he used this analogy of the sun, which is actually kind of genius when you think about it.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So he's like, imagine the sun itself. That's like God the Father,
Okay.
the light that comes from the sun. That's like God the Son.
I see where you're going with this.
And then the warmth you feel from the sun. That's like the Holy Spirit.
That's actually a really clear image.
It is right.
Even back then, they knew how to use a good analogy.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, are there ways we could be explaining these ideas today that would make them even clearer?
That's a great question. One we should all be thinking about. But, you know, Eleutherius wasn't just teaching about the Trinity.
Right. He was also calling out what he saw as bad theology.
Exactly. What they called back then heresies.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't experts in ancient religious debates, what exactly was he up against?
Well, he was dealing with groups who had very different ideas about who Jesus was and what his role was in salvation.
Okay, so like what? Give me some examples.
So, for example, some people back then denied the virgin birth.
Which is a pretty central idea in Christianity.
Huge. I mean, that was central to understanding Jesus' divine nature.
Right.
Then you had others who really struggled to reconcile Jesus being both fully God and fully human.
Yeah. That's always been a mind bender.
It really is. I mean, how can someone be both divine and human at the same time? It's a tough one.
So these weren't just like abstract theological arguments happening in some ivory tower somewhere.
No, not at all.
These debates actually had real implications for how people lived their lives.
Absolutely. What you believed about Jesus affected everything about how you understood your faith.
And probably how you lived your life, too.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? These debates weren't always polite disagreements either.
Oh, I bet things could get heated.
Oh, yeah. There's actually a record of a synod where Eleutherius straight up called out those who were teaching that Christ was divided into two.
Divided into two. What does that even mean?
Well, basically, it was this idea that Jesus had two separate natures, one divine and one human, and that these natures were totally separate from each other.
Okay, so kind of like a split personality.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And Eleutherius, he wasn't having it.
So he just called them out right there in front of everyone.
He did. And his language is strong. He accuses them of spreading falsehoods and leading people astray.
Wow. Talk about a power move.
Right. But it just shows how seriously they took these theological debates back then.
Yeah, it makes you think, have we really come that far in our ability to handle disagreements today?
That's a great question. One worth pondering for sure.
Yeah.
But you know what makes Eleutherius even more interesting?
What's that?
His story isn't just about theological debates.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. He was also said to have performed miracles.
Miracles. Okay, now we're talking.
And not just any miracles. Miracles involving relics.
Relics? You mean like ancient artifacts associated with saints?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Objects that were believed to have spiritual power.
All right, now this is getting good. Let's talk about these miracles. Because who doesn't love a good miracle story?
Right.
Especially one involving ancient relics with mysterious powers.
Yeah, these relics were a big deal in the early church. Like, people really believed they could connect to the divine through them. You know, kind of tap into the holiness of these important figures.
And Eleutherius was totally on board with this whole relic thing.
Oh, yeah. He was all about it.
So we're talking some pretty wild stories, right? Like
Yeah, we're
using relics to heal the sick kind of thing?
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this one story about Eleutherius coming back from Rome,
Okay.
and he's got these relics with him
From who?
from Saint Mary of Egypt and Saint Stephen.
Okay, so like big deal saints.
Huge. And you got to imagine the scene when he gets back to Tournai.
What's it like?
It's like a total celebration. Crowds of people, music clergy, all dressed up in their fancy robes.
Like a ticker tape parade, but instead of confetti, it's like blessings and awe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were psyched to have these relics in their city.
So it wasn't just like a PR stunt.
No.
People actually believed these things had power?
Oh, yeah, they totally did.
So what kind of power are we talking about?
Well, the story says that as they were parading these relics through town,
Okay.
people started noticing this radiant light around them,
No way. Like they're glowing.
glowing, especially the relic of Saint Stephen.
Okay, so glowing relics. That's pretty cool. But what about the healing?
Oh, right. So there was this group of sick people.
What were they sick with?
They had this awful affliction. I think it was called the fire of hell or something like
The
that.
fire of hell. That sounds rough.
Yeah, doesn't sound pleasant at all. And there were 6 of them, 4 men and 2 women.
Okay. And then what happened?
Well, Eleutherius,
Yeah.
he takes the relics,
Yeah.
the head of Saint Mary,
Mm.
and the shoulder of Saint Stephen,
Okay.
and he places them in front of these sick people.
Traumatic.
Right, and he's like, everyone pray with me,
Hmm.
invoking his authority as bishop and the power of these saints.
And what happened?
Well, according to the story, they were all instantly cured.
No way! Get out of here!
I know, it's pretty wild.
So they were totally healed.
Completely. Their skin was restored. Even this one guy who was mute could suddenly speak again.
That's amazing. It's like something out of a movie.
It really is. And I mean, we can be skeptical and be like, oh, those stories are just legends.
Right.
But for people back then, this was like proof.
Proof that their faith was real?
Exactly. It gave them hope and strengthened their belief in the power of the church.
It's like you always have to remember the context of these stories, what
Yeah.
they meant to the people who told them and heard them. Well, as much as I love a good miracle story,
Yeah.
our deep dive on Eleutherius takes a bit of a turn when we get to his death.
Yeah, things get a little dark.
What happened?
Well, even the holiest of men meet their end.
That's true.
And Eleutherius' death, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly peaceful.
Oh no, what do you mean?
Remember all those theological debates we were talking about?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out those disagreements had some pretty serious consequences.
Like what kind of consequences?
Well, Eleutherius had been leading the church in Tournai for years,
right.
strengthening their faith and calling out those who he believed were teaching false things.
And not everyone was happy about that.
Not at all. There were some people who really didn't like what he was doing.
So it wasn't just like a war of words.
Yeah.
There were actual tensions simmering beneath the surface.
A big time.
So what happened?
Well, one day, Eleutherius is leaving the church with his deacon and a disciple.
Okay.
And this group of guys, people who opposed him, they ambushed them.
Whoa. Are you serious?
Yeah, they were waiting for him, filled with anger and resentment.
That's intense. It's like something out of a history book.
Right. It just goes to show you how powerful these beliefs were to people.
Yeah, and how dangerous those differences in belief could be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, they attack him.
Oh, no. What did they do?
Oh, yeah, it was bad. They beat him up, left him for dead right there outside the church.
That's awful. You would think that people who disagreed about religion could at least, like, I don't know, agree to disagree.
Right, you'd hope so. But this was serious business back then.
Clearly. So what happened to Eleutherius? Did he die there?
Well, he survived the attack,
Okay.
but he was pretty badly hurt.
Yeah, I bet.
I mean, the stories say he was covered in blood.
That's terrible.
It is. To think of this guy who dedicated his life to his faith, being attacked like that by his own people.
So did anyone help him?
Yeah, eventually people found him,
Okay.
and they carried him back to his house.
So what happened next?
Well, he was basically bedridden for the next 5 weeks.
5 weeks? That's a long time.
It is. Especially back then without modern medicine.
Right. So he was just lying there dying.
Well, yeah, he knew his time was short.
So what did he do?
He kept doing what he always did. He ministered to his people.
Even though he was dying.
Even then, he performed miracles. He comforted the sick. He prayed with people.
Wow. Talk about dedication.
I know, right? It's pretty incredible.
So did he eventually, pass away?
He did, but not before delivering one final powerful prayer.
A dying man's last words. That's got to be moving.
It is. And you know what's interesting?
Yeah.
Even on his deathbed, Eleutherius was still thinking about those theological debates.
The ones that got him into trouble in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He starts his prayer by reaffirming the Trinity.
So he's like, just to be clear, I still believe in one God in three persons.
Basically. It's like he wanted to make sure his followers wouldn't stray from that core belief.
Makes sense considering he'd spent his whole life defending it.
Absolutely. But his prayer wasn't just about theology.
What else did he say?
He also prayed for his people.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful.
It is. He asked God to protect them, to strengthen their faith, to guide them after he was gone.
What a kind and compassionate man.
He really was. And you know what's even more amazing?
What?
He forgave the people who attacked him.
He forgave them. Seriously.
He did. He asked God to have mercy on them.
That's incredible, to forgive someone who's hurt you that badly.
It's a powerful testament to his faith.
It really is.
But-
So what happened next?
Well, after that final act of forgiveness, Eleutherius breathed his last breath.
Wow. What a story.
It really is. From theological powerhouse to humble servant.
Right. He lived a life full of passion and conviction, but also full of compassion and forgiveness.
He really did. And his story still has something to teach us today.
Like what?
Like how to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard.
And how to forgive even when we've been wronged.
Exactly. Eleutherius reminds us that even in the face of adversity, faith, forgiveness, and humility can still shine through.
Those are powerful words to live by. Well, that's it for a deep dive on Saint Eleutherius of Tournai, a 6th century bishop who wasn't afraid to tackle the big questions. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.